Julien Gagnon Walker Room, which is at the end of the hall, the three big rooms together where the meet and greet was last night. If anybody was there, staff will direct you. The other concurrent session is Pandemic to Prosperity, and that one you go a little bit further, it's down the hall, Suzor Cote, and again, they'll direct you there. Take everything with you from this room, though, when you go to those breakout sessions, because you're not coming back here. They're going to start setting this up for the gala tonight. So when you leave for that breakout session at 3:15, that's when our break is, but you're not coming back after the break until the gala tonight, and they're going to clean off all the tables. So don't leave anything behind, please. Okay, I see Shannin. No, they're still waiting for their microphones. What else can I tell you about? Any questions? Let me see. Okay, so after that last, those breakout sessions, those should finish around 4:30. And then you got roughly a half-hour break. We're having a cocktails/reception from 5 to 6 p.m. That's just out here in the foyer. And the reason we do that is because we need everybody to come into this room at 6 p.m. sharp, because we have a heavy schedule tonight. Dinner's served almost immediately. We have some speeches, and we have 6 awards to give out, I believe. So we have a full evening. So if everybody could be down here by 6 p.m. at the latest, but come down early if you want, have a drink and get ready. We have prizes tomorrow. I think that was mentioned at one point. So tomorrow we're doing a draw. We have 5 iPads to give away. Okay, you have to be here. And we do this at the end of tomorrow, and that's to keep everybody to stay to the end. We don't want you to leave, excuse me, we don't want you to leave before the elder does the closing prayer, for instance, right? So we'd like everyone to stay right to the end. Right after the closing prayer, then we do a draw for 5 iPads. If you're not here, sorry, pick another name. Okay, so that's to keep everybody here to the end of the day. And what else can I tell you? Fred, how are you doing? Awesome. Fred Cattrall's the photographer here, takes amazing photos. Appreciate that all the time, Fred. Don't forget to support the Indigenous vendors out front. There's the 5 vendors that are in the hallway. Please support them. They've been waiting for occasions like this for a long time. Are you almost ready, Shannin? Okay, so this next panel is Innovations in Indigenous Financing. So it's going to be moderated by NACA CEO Shannin Metatawabin, and then he can introduce the five panelists. So they're just getting ready. They're getting their mics together.
If we can get to the panelists to the front. Jean Vincent, Bobby Alawa, Keith Martel, Karen Kastner, Don Madabi, make your way to the front, please.
Okay, so the panelists can come on up and have a seat.
Oh, you're Karen. Okay. Great. Nice to meet you. Sorry, I missed the prep meeting with Bobby.
We only have 5 microphones.
I think people thought it was great. Where you want me to sit in?
Do you have a preference? Do you have a preference?
are we? It's at moments like these that I wish I had bifocals. Hey. Aw. You just have a better memory than I do, clearly.
When he said the word break, I think everybody broke. What we're going to do is we're going to just call everybody outside to come back in. I think we want to make sure that we have people here. Just give me 2 seconds.
It's the witching hour. It's our conferences. Yeah.
I really like how I didn't know you already started your healthy morning.
We're going to get started. We have a really important panel right now. As the market,
Don.
look, we take pictures later. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being at the conference. I think so far we've been presented with some amazing panels and some amazing discussions. And this one here that I would like to jump into, excuse me, Jean. This one here is one of the impending big market opportunities we have for Indigenous people. We've been talking to access to capital for decades. We have Keith Martel here, who is the CEO for the First Nations Bank of Canada. Jean opened up the forum with the announcement of all the achievements of NACA and the launch of the Indigenous Growth Fund. We have Don Madabi, who represents the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, Karen Kastner from the BDC, and Bobby Alawa from Kosher Capital. I'd like each of them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about each of their organizations that they represent. And then we have some questions that we're going to cover that speaks to the opportunity, the risks, and some of the gaps that exist that all our allies, partners, and government can assist us with ensuring that we continue down this journey. So I'm going to start with Jean, if you can begin.
All right, thank you, Shannon. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So then briefly, I will introduce myself. My name is Jean Vincent, among other things. So I'm the chair of NACA. Also, I am the chair of two other Indigenous financial institutions based in Quebec, SOCA and ABSCAN. And also I sit on the First Nations Market Housing Fund as a trustee. I would say that my main focus has been always access to affordable capital for different needs. Just a brief reminder, we know that it has been always difficult for First Nations to access capital for three main reasons. First, the existence of the Indian Act, also the remoteness of the communities, and finally, I would say that First Nations have been always perceived as a higher risk by the conventional lenders. Most of my career has been dedicated to the implementation of innovative financial products in the Indigenous context. So we founded SOCA back in 1992. And SOCA is an AFI working with the Indigenous entrepreneurs. We made up to $100 million loan over the last 30 years. Then we set up also a venture capital fund in Quebec. And finally, we set up ABSCAN in 2005. This is the one that I will talk about this afternoon.
Thank you, Jean. Don?
Midawabin Dishnakas, Chijak Dodem, the Dom the Sing Donjaba, Anikinuia.
It's so nice to be here. My name is Dawn Madabi Leach, and I'm the chair of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. I'm also the general manager of an Indigenous financial institution known as the Wabatek Business Development Corporation. And I also serve on the board of directors of Peace Hills Trust, one of Canada's first Indigenous banks. So I've been involved in financing and looking at economic programs for our people for many years. So I'm happy to be on this panel today and join everyone. Miigwech.
Thank you. Karen?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Kastner. I'm from BDC. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I don't know if it's because I haven't been at a conference in over 2 years, but this one is fantastic. And I really appreciated all the other panelists thus far. I am responsible at BDC for partnerships and government relations, and that means that I have one of the best positions at BDC because I get to work with organizations across the country to see how we can work with them to increase access to BDC through all the great partners that are working at the community level.
Keith?
Shannon. So nice to see a crowd for a change, and like you, I'm looking forward to seeing many more people. I'm not looking forward to traveling as much as I used to, so that must be something that wore off after 2 years of not doing it. As Shannon mentioned, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of First Nations Bank of Canada. First Nations Bank of Canada is actually an offshoot of the success of AFIs. Our original parent company was the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation, who did, as many of all the AFIs, so much good in creating opportunities for Indigenous entrepreneurs, Indigenous communities to invest in business and economic enterprise within their communities. And we were an offshoot of that. So as CEIF started to see their customers get more successful and look for traditional forms of financing, they still found that for the most part, banking for Indigenous communities was like much of the economy was a one-way street. It was deposits out, no loans in. It was equity out to partners, no equity into the communities. And so they saw part of the solution was the creation of First Nations Bank. Today, we're about $1.2 billion in total assets, and 90% of the loan activity we do is with Indigenous communities, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities all across the country. And we're 87% owned, widely held by many First Nations and Inuit shareholders from across the country. And I think, as I mentioned, the real creation of the bank was so that we didn't have a one-way street to economy, and we're seeing that change significantly. There's a lot of things we need to continue to do, but we continue to focus on making sure all the parts are in play so that Indigenous communities can really participate in the economy, and it's a two-way street of economic opportunity.
Thank you. And a new face on the panel, and you've probably never seen this guy before, Bobby Alawa.
Thanks, Shannon. I appreciate the invitation. My name is Bobby Alawalia. I'm the managing partner of Courage Capital. Courage Capital is a private investment firm focused on mid-market private equity investments in North America. Central to our investment thesis is incorporating ESGI principles in the post-investment value creation plan after we make an investment. And prior to my time in private equity, I spent the first 10 years of my career in capital markets in London and New York. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation and bringing maybe a unique, different perspective to the panel here.
I think what's really important is we're on a journey of financial sovereignty. We talk about data sovereignty, Indigenous people wanting to protect our data, have that as something that we choose to do with. And I think we're on a journey here of financial sovereignty. So I wanted to ask Keith to give us a little bit more insight into the reasons why the First Nation Bank of Canada came into being, what your ownership structure looks like, what sort of services you have right now, and where you're sort of heading.
Sure, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and I think I mentioned at the beginning, we were really meant to be a conduit to Indigenous engagement and economic opportunity, and that's what banking is to a great extent. It enables entrepreneurs, business owners to leverage their equity. And so, you know, as a business owner, whether you're a First Nation community or a entrepreneur, an individual, a certain amount of any business success is how much equity you put into it. Some of that comes from loans or grants or an AFI that doesn't require you to repay the whole amount. But you leverage that resource, you leverage that equity through borrowing, through getting outside investors. And that's really what we created, was an opportunity for First Nations not to have to equity finance everything they did. You know, my dad started construction business on reserve, owned buses that were driving the kids in the community to school instead of the neighboring farmers doing all that work. And when he first started that business, everything he invested in, he had to find $1 in his own pocket to finance 100% of every asset he owned, because nobody would lend to an asset on reserve. And so when First Nations Bank was created, we found ways to really leverage the opportunities for equity to grow. And that's really what we think is important, is not just access to capital as a whole, capital stack. It's equity, it's borrowed debt, it's outside investors, it's joint venture interests. And having access to that whole capital stack is, I think, part of what we're really interested in. We want to leverage more comparability to how Indigenous business is financed in Canada.
Thank you. Now going to Karen, the BDC has been getting involved in Indigenous business development and have participated in a partnership with NACA in the development of the Indigenous Growth Fund. And we heard earlier that it wasn't an easy journey and there was some thinking outside the box. So maybe you can speak a little bit about BDC's plan, strategy, and the thinking outside the box.
Sure. Well, we've, you know, been supporting Indigenous businesses for several years, mainly through a direct channel. So we have an Indigenous business loan. We have about over 900 Indigenous businesses currently as clients, $500 million at play there. We also do other work on financial acumen or education. But we realize that even though our direct business, which, you know, Monica, my colleague, is here and is kind of the face of BDC for the last 20 years in this space, even though those loans had grown over the last 10 years, let's say threefold, we realized that we weren't really serving the community as well as we could. And luckily, we, you know, partnered with NACA and were able to really kind of move away from what I think is a mindset of we could do everything on our own to how do we partner with organizations that have relationships in the community and not only help ultimately the clients that they serve, but also help them to serve the clients that they serve. And that was really the genesis of the Indigenous Growth Fund. And there were so many innovations associated with that structure, and it was, Shannin wouldn't have said this earlier when he was on the panel, but without his, you know, resilience and, you know, complete steadfastness, this fund would never have gotten off the ground. So it wasn't necessarily an easy journey. It was a bumpy journey, and it was a tremendously rewarding journey. But the reason that it wasn't an easy journey is because there were so many new features to the way we did business and all the objectives that we ultimately wanted to achieve through the structure that I think we did. I mean, time will tell, but when you kind of go through it, we had one objective, obviously, affordable loans. We had another objective of being able to incent private sectors to come in and invest. So how do you create an incentive for that to happen? The building of an ownership stake in the fund by the community, by the fund manager. So a number of the whole idea of this evergreen fund, that it doesn't have an end, all of these things pose challenges because they were the first time we did them. But, great partner. We came at this with a lot of humility and in listening mode. And I think that we ended up with something that, it may not be perfect, but it's pretty damn good.
Thank you very much, Karen. Don, you wear a couple of hats. You're an AFI general manager, and you've managed that AFI for a while, and you're also on the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. And for the past 2 years, you've been working on a national Indigenous economic strategy. Can you maybe socialize and talk a little bit about what is in that report that'll support this move to innovative financing and attract more capital to our communities?
Yes, thank you, Shannon. First, I want to say that a lot of what the report talks about, which it'll be released actually on June 6th, and this National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada has been developed by Indigenous people. We were the ones holding the pen, not the government. This is the first time ever that the strategy for Canada has been developed by us, and for Canada. So in the strategy, we have 4 strategic pathways. We have people, lands, infrastructure, and finance. We also have 107 calls to economic prosperity in this strategy. And we're really excited to be releasing this on June 6th here in Ottawa. We will have a press release at a press conference at that time. So we're looking forward to sharing that strategy. But in that strategy, it talks about quite a few things here. One of the main things it talks about is the government's role really should be to invest in Indigenous-led institutions, so that those institutions must have a strong mandate from the Indigenous community and a solid business plan, of course. We feel that government should not be a deliverer of programs and services to our people. We feel that we have a better success rate in program delivery, and no one understands our needs in our communities better than we do. We feel we could do a better job in delivering infrastructure programming, administering our own education, opening doors to contracting and procurement opportunities, working with our clients to do that, managing our own national Indigenous business directory. We can also manage our own citizenship. But there's programs that exist right now, such as that are being administered by ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, such as a CORE program. I don't know why that's not already devolved to an organization like NACA, which helps communities with larger investments. When we look at the kind of equity that's required by our business people now and our communities now, we look at the billion-dollar deal with the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia in Clearwater, but we also have smaller deals that could be helped by us delivering that kind of a program and having that program, the capital for that enhanced. So I think that, looking at the future, I really feel that it should be us delivering those kinds of programs. We have better success rates than when the government administers a business program. That was the business case made back when NACA first started and the AFI network started. We could do a better job, and we've proven that. We have a strong success rate for the businesses that we invest in. So there's simple things that can be done now, and the strategy will outline some of those types of ideas that we need to see going forward, but especially that investment in equity capital to help our communities, for example, acquire a printing company or go into partnership with a printing company. That kind of capital is beyond what AFIs have right now. I think the Indigenous Growth Fund that we spoke about earlier today will help, but we still need equity capital that you don't just borrow. Sometimes you need that money because you want to start generating revenues right away for those communities to invest in other opportunities. So there's a lot to do. So thank you very much.
So Jean, you've rolled out an innovative financial model for housing at Abscan, and I was really amazed at the success of that program. So maybe you can tell the audience about why you entered that field, how you made the change, and some of the successes that you've had.
I was not aware about that. Yes, during the introduction, I mentioned that the First Nations are facing a lot of difficulties to access capital. So then, and I would say that the biggest gap is about housing. AFN estimates a gap of $60 billion just in housing. But talking about housing, so we know that there is a continuum of different solutions. So going from free housing at one end of the spectrum to homeownership at the other end of the spectrum. Me, I live in a community where we have a revolving loan fund working since 1969. I estimate that about 85% of our people are home owner. But in 2005, two things. First, the sister company, SOCA, needed to access more capital. So finally, we decided to set up Abscan, Aboriginal Savings Corporation of Canada. And this one has the capacity to issue corporate bonds. So then through the bond issues, so we are raising capital. And the first days, so we use this capital to provide SOCA with the kind of capital that it needed at that time to make more loans to the indigenous entrepreneurs. But down the road, we understood that Abscan could play also a role in the housing sector. And only in my community, so finally the revolving loan fund was completely loaned out. And so we began to make loans to the community, and in counterpart, so my community was able to make more loans to our people the year on when that. And so then afterwards, we thought that if it was possible maybe to replicate this model elsewhere. And so then we began to work with other communities as well. I have prepared some notes, but I will not I will not read them because we're going to be here until midnight, I think. So I would like just to pick up and choose. So then, yeah, we would like to replicate. So put together a program not just to reproduce, but to accelerate what's done in one decade. It involved working with individuals and community leaders to lay the groundwork for homeownership finance, starting with the low-lying fruits. Privatizations and the renovation of community housing, for example, and financing of densified social housing to reduce pressure where no new homes had been built in a decade. A couple of early adopters with the means went ahead and built the new homes. All of this in communities with no capacity to provide lenders with guarantees, where ISC won't provide the ministerial guarantees, and where banks don't do housing. With help from the McConnell Foundation, followed by help from ISC and CMHC, we tested that approach. We improved it, we expanded it, we confirmed the demand, the feasibility, and demonstrated our capacity to mitigate risk. Like in Wendake 50 years before, early adopters' success generated increased local support for further transformations of the roles, regimes, and disincentives left behind by the old way of doing things. All in all, since 2005, a bit under $25 million in housing loans, 250 homes both built or renovated. One-third of that is the new program for communities where home ownership is new. COVID came and went, and the loans continue to perform without missing a beat. As of today, here also, no defaults and no losses since the inception. So I have to tell you that since 2005, in fact, the AppScan has issued $50 million in bonds, and we use this capital to make loans in the communities, half of that for housing. And so far, we never had any default and any loss. So now the question is, can we grow? How can we grow this to scale? First Nations member savings won't suffice institutional investors, and they're interested but want rated bond issues, bigger volumes, broader diversification of risk with more regions involved. We know local ownership, local knowledge, and our established relationships with First Nations are the key to our success. Growing to scale meant partnerships with like-minded Indigenous organizations in other regions, building up the instruments for support to individuals and to local leaders that won't change, aggregation of loans to optimize portfolio mix, pooling of needs for the critical mass to access capital of optimal cost, as well as instruments to raise affordable capital in much bigger increments. I think that I will stop here, and maybe then we could
we'll talk a
continue
little
with
bit more about that.
additional
Yeah,
information.
for sure. I'm going to go over to Bobby now. Now, Bobby, you've been to 2 panels now. You've started to meet our community and understand that this is essentially an untapped market, and representing the market. What is the opportunity here? What are some of the takeaways that you see as a way to connect it closer?
Yeah, I mean, at the most fundamental basis, private capital flows to attractive assets and opportunities. And that's what underpins most of institutional investors' work. We're really good at assessing risk and managing investment risk. We're not good at managing political risk, reputational risk, social risk. And those are some of the challenges that come up when talking about the Indigenous investment landscape. If we're speaking about innovative ways to overcome these challenges, the government has a role to play. Direct investing, whether debt or equity from the government, does have its role in investment projects and businesses. But more so, the government should be used in a way to pave the path for private capital to invest. The single best way for an investor to understand the market, understand the landscape, is to put money to work. And so the government should encourage private investors to invest into the space. How can they do that? There's lots of innovative ways, and not even innovative ways, ways that have been around the market for a long time, whether it's guarantees, revenue concessions, backstops, equity backstops, taxes. I think the tax equation is one area where there hasn't been a lot of work done, but it's been used in other sectors to stimulate investment. And so that's another area. $1 of government direct finance versus $1 of government-enabled private capital is very different value. And private capital needs to be involved. And if the government can be used and leveraged in ways to adjust the risk-reward equation for private capital, it starts to build the track record for institutional investors investing in the space, the trust, the relationships that are all required for big amounts of capital come into the sector.
Thank you, Keith. There's a lot more capital coming into our communities. Our AFIs are the conduit of the relationship. They understand the projects, they understand the communities, and sometimes the communities don't understand all the sources of capital. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the risk, the impending wave of capital coming to our communities.
Sure, and I think that's one thing that I'm hearing a lot more sophistication from Indigenous communities, but I still hear a lot of confusion because people talk about capital as if it's a commodity. Like when people say we need more capital, I always sort of joke, like, how many pounds of capital do you need? Like, what is capital? Like, capital can be a grant that you don't have to repay. It can be your grandmother lending you money that she wants back, but she's patient. Capital can be a bank loan. Capital can be equity from an institutional investor who wants a return. And every kind of capital is a split of risk and return. So if you were 100% owner of a business and all of the money you put into that business is your own owned dollars, 100% of the return is going to go to you. You don't have to pay anybody interest. You don't have to pay anybody a participation benefit. It's really all your return. If you want others to take a lot of the risk, you're going to have to part with part of the return, like you mentioned. And so I think that's something that we need to be a lot more sophisticated about, because I hear sometimes entrepreneurs, for example, say, we need more capital. And what they sometimes mean is we need more loans, or we need more grants, or sometimes when the bank tells them you need more equity, they're not hearing that they have to put in some of their own capital if they want to share in the return. Because if you really want somebody else to take all of the risk, then unfortunately you're going to see them take all of the return. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of the industry partnerships we're seeing out there. So they want First Nations to invest in a pipeline, partly because they want the First Nations to approve the pipeline. So, they find ways to find equity, and they find ways to get borrowed money and government grants. And when you slice and dice all the return, you find out that the equity build from that investment is almost nothing. And return, to be blunt, and I hate to be the banker on the panel, maybe Don will back me up on this, but I think everybody else will too. Return comes from some equity, and that's the real difference I think that we're seeing in First Nations communities. We have a trust company. We manage about 14 trusts that have about $1 billion of assets under management. And even before we created the trust company, many of our bank clients had trusts. And in those trusts, they have equity. And they have a lot more opportunity because they're not borrowing everything that they invest. They're taking, one First Nations community we dealt with, they really were able to cut a check whenever an opportunity arose that was really a good opportunity. They didn't have to go around scrounging for debt or government grants or all these kind of things. And they could structure the deal the way they wanted to, not how some government department or bureaucrat said, you should really do this. And that's one of the things that I think that kind of equity allows us to do, is we don't have to be as dependent on what I call incomparable structures. So something that isn't done anywhere else in the world. And there's too many times in the past where First Nations really were dependent on these structures that were developed by government. And, as a First Nations person my whole life, I don't know what part of the government wants to help. We keep getting sucked into it. The structure that they do for business is usually terrible. They're not very good business people. They might be great government officials, but they're not good business people. And so taking advice from them on how to structure our business developments is something that we're getting over and we're getting past because we have equity and we're accessing the right parts of the capital stack.
Thank you. So talking about risk, on the market side, Karen, what are some of the risks to market capital and the bank capital that the communities can start to build capacity and adjust to, and what can the governments do to make that transition a little bit easier? And I'll throw it back to Bobby after you're done.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of interesting examples in the last decade or so where the government has realized that maybe it's not in the best position to structure something, and they've actually come to BDC. We've seen it in venture capital. My colleagues here from BDC Capital have been, very involved in a couple of programs that have taken a government investment and created a structure that incents private sector investment and makes more out of that dollar. Instead of the government dollar just being a flow through, it actually brings in private sector investment to create some track record that, that with the hope that eventually the government isn't needed anymore because you've created a track record of success. That's the same model that we built the Indigenous Growth Fund on, right? The government money was there, and it was through a very creative share structure. That government money was used as a way to both incent private sector create private sector returns, so incent private sector investment, and also build that ownership by the fund manager, NACA. So I think that, as a Crown, because we're closer to the market than maybe the government is, and do have some expertise in certain areas, we can, and also have a mandate, frankly, to play a development role. We can play that role in a way that creates structures to benefit the community.
Thank you. And Bobby, the market has some expectations of where they're going to invest. What are some of the things that you see as opportunities and risks?
Yeah, and we're talking about structures. I think there is generally a gap of bridging the two groups, the financial sector, Bay Street, with the opportunities. A role of an intermediary that can bring together Bay Street institutional investors, government, Indigenous organizations, all the way down to the communities, is kind of a gap I see. If Keith and I are sitting in our Bay Street office and have no connection to the Indigenous communities or the world, this space, and we say, hey, we want to put $10 million, $20 million into the Indigenous investment space, who do we call? Like, who would I pick up the phone and call? I could do a Google search and I might find NACA and I might find the First Nations Bank, but then the person I speak to, am I having the right conversation with that individual? Whereas if I were to do that at my fund and we target clean energy as a sector that we want to go to, I can call the investment banking division at RBC or Scotia, and within a couple hours, I will understand the landscape within Canada, who the key players are, where the opportunities are, be able to participate in some deal flow and go on that journey. And that's a gap that I think currently exists about bridging that connection and that relationship between the two sectors.
Don, on the demand side, the community, AFI is working with entrepreneurs. What are some of the things that you see as risks that you're seeing on the ground level? What are some of the things that we need to sort of highlight as opportunities to create programs and services and training programs to help this connection between demand and supply?
Well, one of the things that we're finding is that the cost of, not the cost, but the projects are larger now. Just to buy some heavy equipment now, sometimes that heavy equipment's between $400,000 and $500,000, or to build a building now, they're $3 million, and we have clients that need these types of loans and the financing, and it's just been difficult to find that level of support for them unless you go to multiple institutions and you try to see about different kinds of funds and putting that together. And that's really difficult for an average entrepreneur whose talent is in a particular area in the business that they're starting. So that's one of the challenges that I see. And I was thinking about what Keith had to say about how important it is to have equity, and that's always an issue too for entrepreneurs, is having that equity. But I think that if we look at growing our communities in a way where we have good revenue sharing agreements across the country with all of the governments on the resources that are used in our traditional territories. I think that if all the land claims were settled, we have over 300 land claims that still need to be settled across the country. Those bring in the trust funds and the equity that communities would have going forward. There's so many opportunities for Indigenous communities and Indigenous entrepreneurs right now with Canada needs us really to move forward when you think about it, because I heard last week about in Canada, there's $6 trillion worth of projects that would need to happen to achieve net zero and the climate change. I think, wow, we need to be in on that. Indigenous people that need to help lead the way in terms of addressing the environmental issues that we're experiencing today. And then when you look at the resource development projects for the critical minerals needed for the equipment that we use in the future, Indigenous people can be involved in all of those projects. If we settle all the equity requirements with the resource revenue sharing, with the land claims, and with the reinstatement of the funds that Shannin was talking about earlier today, how the AFIs and the network and the programs were there and were gutted over the years, and we're starting to rebuild with things like the Indigenous Growth Fund, but that's a loan fund. We need more equity investments for sure from all over. I know that Keith talked about the dangers of that, because you have to follow certain criteria in order to get that. But I think that we're progressing in a way right now. Our people are becoming more sophisticated. You look at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, where they're all working together to teach each other about some of the downfalls that they've had, but all the successes as well. So I think we're on the verge of some great development here, but Indigenous people need to be involved. And I can tell you that Canada's future economy is going to be reliant on the involvement of Indigenous people.
Thank you. Thank you, Bethany. So Jean, you talked about your successful Abscan housing model. You've changed the culture of Indigenous people taking out mortgages on reserve, where that's always been a difficult environment because of the history of housing on reserve. How would you take that, and what have you done with that to change that culture, and what do we need to do to amplify that on a national scale?
Yeah, in fact, I mentioned that we are trying to replicate what's going on in my community, and I think that we have to change the mentality. For many First Nations and many Indigenous people, housing is seen as a right, and it's a political thing, and I don't want to talk about that necessarily. But I mentioned that in order to solve the housing crisis, so we need to access $60 billion in capital. Just the home ownership component represent about 10% of the entire needs. And so we know for sure that government will never provide, this kind of capital. So then we have to get out of the old paradigms, and at the end of the day, I think that we have to make people responsible of their housing. And so that's why, in our case, we offer a program where, and in fact, it's not the one silver bullet solutions that we are offering. So we target the homeownership component, but we want to offer to individuals who have good jobs, good income, who are credit worthy. We want to offer them this capacity to borrow money in order to build their homes, but then at the end of the day, for sure, so they have to repay the loans. But in life you have two choices. So maybe you can wait for a lifetime, and you will never have a home. But on the other side, if you have an opportunity to borrow money, so then maybe you could build your home, and at the end of the day, it's going to be an asset for yourself. Having said that, I think that government could play a role in the kind of program that we are offering. So the kind of capital that we need is in the capital markets. And so then I think that government could play a role as a facilitator, and instead to use the financial resources that are available in order to build more and more free housing. So then maybe government should use this capital in order to set up and put in place guarantee mechanisms, kind of loan loss reserve and so on. So in order to make a link between the capital markets, where really the capital is, and the indigenous and organizations in the field that could deploy this kind of capital. So anyway, it's I don't have necessarily all the time, to explain all the details of our program, but really we want to change mentality, and we want to get rid of the old paradigms, and where at the end of the day all the housing programs require that First Nations absorb all the losses at the end of the day. So we want really to get rid of that. We want to make all stakeholders responsible for housing. So the financial institutions that make loans just don't make profit, but also the financial institutions so have to take risk. The individuals who want to access and want to have a home, so they have to borrow and then they have to repay the loan and so on. So we want really to make all the stakeholders responsible in this kind of new mindset that we would like to develop.
Thank you. I'll go back to Keith. You talked about the trust that you just started, the trust service. And we talked about some of the barriers that may exist within the trust sector. There's about $25 billion in trust money out there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And it goes to that equity opportunity, like how do you access equity? So, when a First Nation community, an Inuit regional organization, Métis government settles a claim and those resources come into their control, that adds a huge benefit. As I mentioned earlier, the difference between a community that has a trust and equity and one that doesn't is really night and day, because the ones that do have that equity have so much more opportunity to leverage it. But some of the challenges we have to overcome are that traditionally a lot of our settlements, the money's gone straight into managed funds. So you buy a bunch of equities in other people's businesses in other countries. You buy a bunch of bonds issued by government, which fund other things that governments do or that corporations do. You maybe buy real estate, but none of it's on reserve or in your community. And that whole idea of using some of your own equity to build your own economy is sort of foreign. If you look at some of the largest trusts in Canada, for example, the Nunavut Trust that was created when Nunavut was created, it originally had over $1 billion. And I think, reading between the lines of its investment policy, it would invest everywhere in the world except Nunavut. And which was a real irony. The benefit was going back to the people of Nunavut, the returns were going back to the people of Nunavut, but none of the capital was driving economic development in Nunavut. Now, they did take some of that money and it created some institutions in the region, but it's far from the $1 billion that's being invested everywhere else in the world. And I know as a trustee or as the individual community and the leadership in a community, you want that money to be safe, you want it to be sustainable. But we need to create mechanisms whereby some of that money can go into what I call local private equity. So and some of the trusts we work with, it's not easy, but they've found a way to do that. The one community I was on a trust board for in Alberta I think I was on that board for 18 years. Small amount of equity. The community was in a great opportunity for economic development. They took about half that money and ended up investing it locally. And when you compare the returns that came from those local investments and you compare it to the stocks and bonds and real estate that the other half was invested in, the lion's share of the return for the trust came from the local investments. But that takes discipline. If you're simply taking people without a lot of experience and allowing them to invest in whatever, or have a bunch of outside parties come in and sell them the greatest investment idea of the month, then there's a lot of risk in that. But if you have a community that can think structurally, what's in our best interest? Where do we have ownership opportunities? Where do we have the people capacity to build a business? If you can invest in that and leverage some of that investment, that equity you have in your trusts into that sector, I think the return for communities would be greater than anything you're going to get from stock market traded securities.
Excellent. Bobby, you raised that you have nobody to call if you're in the market. Let's say that there was somebody to call. What would be the ideal conditions of what the role of that intermediary would be to assist the market?
Yeah, I mean, the capital markets, the investment banks, the traditional ones, there's always a two-way relationship between the buy side and the sell side. And that starts from, the origination of any transactions, to the structuring of transactions, to the distribution of transactions. So the relationship of this intermediary would be truly a partner between both sides of the street, the buy side and the sell side. And to function properly, you have to bring in, at a certain level, the institutional investors to the table at the right time when you're structuring transactions, because it can either make or break how those investments go, and whether there's participation on it. So without that bridge between the two entities and two sides of the equation, it's really tough for anyone that's not ingrained into the space to engage in those conversations. And so it's really important to have those relationships and that trust built on both sides. And I think that there's just generally an awareness gap as well. Over the past couple months at the conferences I've been at, speaking with individuals, there's a lot of really good case studies in the Indigenous investment space. A lot of really successful projects and investments have been made that can be shown to the institutional investor community, but those stories aren't being told. That storytelling is not happening. And there's definitely a gap around awareness on Bay Street about the opportunities, but also the successes that have already taken place.
Excellent. I want to take a question from the audience. If you guys want to, this is a really high-level panel here. We've got almost every sector covered here. I want to open it up. We've got about 12 minutes left, and I want to give them an opportunity to have closing remarks and to offer some nuggets for government and what their role could be. But is there anybody that has a question right now? You guys are getting filled up with information, it looks like. So I'm going to go to Don. Don, you represent the National Indigenous Economic Development Board. You're working with government on policy, on strategy. What do you see with all of your work on things that the government can do better to assist all the work that we do? John, if you can just share.
Thank you, Shannon. Well, first of all, I think I really liked what Bobby had to say about the success stories need to be better told, and that's one of the things that we're talking about as a national board, to share some of those case studies more widely on our website, because there's so many amazing stories and people can learn from those. But what I'm seeing happening right now is since COVID started, there's been a lot of progress, even though that we've been working from home and on Zoom screens all this time. I think of the fact that just in the last 2 years, for example, we have Indigenous people now serving on corporate boards and charter bank boards, which you never used to see 2 years ago. This is all news. We have a Indigenous Governor General of Canada. This is a new steps forward. These are success stories showing our capacity is growing. You have new institutions being developed. A lot of work has been done over the past 2 years to work on these institutes. And the other thing that happened because of the fact that we're all working remotely, we've started to reach out and we collaborate more, work together. And all of the national Indigenous organizations have been starting to work together. So I really do think that as we go forward and we're advising, our board's responsibility is to provide advice to the federal government on Indigenous economic development. So we keep sharing some of the progress that's being made. We keep providing advice on different steps that can be made. We're working on the next iteration of the National Indigenous Progress Report, which is sort of like a state of the Indigenous nation in Canada. That's going to be coming out next year. So we're doing a lot of work that gives the basis for these investments in our people and why it's so important to include us. But corporate Canada is really stepping up too during this time. They're reaching out for advice. They're starting to develop reconciliation action plans, and they're realizing that just hiring people or procuring Indigenous business is not enough. They're looking at the board membership. They're looking at actual investments and doing a little bit more than what they have been doing. I think the realization of what's happened from the Truth and Reconciliation report and the discovery of the unmarked graves at residential schools has all opened people's eyes, and people want to step up and help. And I think the government is seeing that too, and all Canadians are seeing that. So the people are looking for ways to help, and we're developing those channels in the economic side because we want to be able to help ourselves in the future, and that's the one way to do that.
Thank you. Karen, the BDC's forward-looking plans and the Crown's role, what sort of advice do you have to offer to the government and Crown's role?
Well, it's a really exciting time because I think over the course of the last years, but especially now, there's been a real shift at BDC toward partnerships and recognizing that we could be much more effective working with other organizations than doing it alone. And so we're really in listening mode and really want to kind of embrace other models and join with other organizations. So I put that offer out there because we want to hear your ideas.
Thank you. Keith, I know you'd say government get out of the way, but what are some of the things that government can continue to do to make sure that the conditions are set for us to
Yeah, I don't think we even rehearsed this interaction, so it's going to be interesting. I got nothing against government. I think government has a very important role to play in Indigenous economic development. I just don't think it's in structuring the structure of a business or in finding ways to finance it, because they tend to give us incomparable structures that actually don't work in business anywhere else in the world. And then we ask, why did it not work? Well, because it was never going to work. It just wasn't going to work right from the beginning. You know, government always asks, like, what can we do? And, you know, I'll throw out the challenge, not just to the Canadian government, but to provincial and First Nations governments. The biggest thing that they can actually do to advance economic development is get K to 12 right. Get basic education from kindergarten to grade 12 correct. If they start having more success in that area, we'll have more success in growing in the economies. So that's one thing it's a big task, but you know, if they could put more resources into getting that right, we could find the resources for creating those opportunities for those talented people that are coming out with education. And the second thing is just the business and the home ownership infrastructure that needs to be there. You know, John, we talked about the home ownership in the First Nations Market Housing Fund this week. And, you know, when it comes to entrepreneurs, a lot of entrepreneurs finance their business through their home equity. In Canada today, in 2021, in Canada, $736 of every $1,000 of housing value in the country was owned by the homeowner, not by the banks. So that means that they had equity of 73% of their home in equity. And they can leverage that if they want to buy a business, if they want to retire, if they want to do lots of things. And we don't know what the statistic is in First Nations, but if I just take the communities that have private home ownership and you exclude that the equity is mostly owned by the First Nations government, the individual equity in housing in Canada for First Nations, I would venture to guess is way below $100. So if you don't have that opportunity, so what we need to create more home ownership, what we need to create more business successes is that infrastructure. It's the rules and regulations of how homes are owned, how businesses are owned. It's the zoning bylaws, all that sort of unsexy stuff that needs to be there for housing ownership and business success. Governments should need to do that. That's the work of government. And that if they get those two things right, I can guarantee we'll have a lot more opportunity to grow businesses in the country.
Thank you very much. Bobby, the market, what do you see the government's role as to ensure that we're creating that right condition to ensure more investment?
Yeah, I think I touched on it in the beginning, but to build on that further, if we're speaking specifically about capital markets and setting up perpetual funding vehicles like the IGF, to Keith's point, they shouldn't be involved in any of the structuring process and any of the deal process. The capital markets have a good ability to provide market solutions. Now, the other end of the equation is whether there's an investor appetite for that, given the risk reward of that solution. That's where the government can insert itself by providing a backstop or a guarantee on those solutions, those instruments that will make it attractive for the private investment market. That's a very tangible thing that's less intensive because they're doing it for other government entities in the market right now. It's nothing new. That can be done relatively straightforward and easily. The other equation of that is just generally aggregating assets to go in these vehicles at a scale that the capital markets requires and institutional investors require. And that might be more of a technical problem that needs to be solved.
Thank you. And I'm going to leave it with Jean. Any nuggets for government that would assist the move of market capital to our Indigenous communities, whether it be for business, for housing?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that in minutes ago, and as Bobby mentioned, I think that we know that within government, so the financial resources are limited, and so instead to use those resources to pay as we go. I think that we should use those resources in order to put in place the kind of mechanism that will allow the capital markets to invest in our communities. And so this is kind of things that we are talking about with the ISC and CMHC at this point in time about the housing program. So then first, I think that government could help in order to give us access to a first tranche of $150 million in order to build a critical mass of loans. But when we will get that point, so then we would like to go out in the market and going through kind of a securitization mechanism, and in order to recycle this capital. And so government could play a role in order to give us this first access to this first $150 million that we need to build this critical mass. But when we will get that point, so then also government could play a role in investing some resources in the mechanisms that will allow the Indigenous organizations to monetize, those first loans, and then so then this is the way that we will get the ball rolling.
Thank you. I want to thank the panelists for being here to educate us a little bit about the risks, the opportunities, and the gaps that exist, and providing some nuggets for government on their role to ensure that there is a steady stream of supply-side capital going to our communities that have a lot of demand. We all know that the government cannot finance the ongoing needs in our communities. We have to reshape and pivot our thoughts on the market capital playing a role. So creating those conditions, creating a continued conversation on how we move towards this. There's lots of equity on the table. We got to create those conditions to connect that equity to our community. So I want to thank you all for coming today, and I want to thank the panelists for sharing today. You give me an hour.
I know, it started late. Okay, folks. Oops, sorry, Shannon. Yeah, so we ran a bit long on that one. That might be my fault. I didn't relay the information properly to Shannon. He thought he had an hour, but they started a bit late. So anyways, no big deal. So that means you're going to have a short break. Please don't skip that last session, the breakout session, right? We've got some great panelists in both breakout sessions. Please go and attend those. I know it's been a long day. So you go down the hall, either the room right at the end, there's staff there to direct you to session 1 or session 2. And then after that, you come back to the foyer anytime between 5 and 6. And we'll see you here for the gala tonight. Thank you.